Hello, everyone. My name is Marcus Tateishi. I'm the president at SolidCAD. We're a software provider and consultant, and I will be the moderator for this panel discussion that we're about to have on digital twins. I intend to ask our panel a few questions that I prepared in advance, and time permitting, we'll be looking at the chat and seeing if there are questions that you have out there. But now let me introduce the panelists. Today, we're lucky enough to have Dominic Corrado, Director of Construction Technology at Balfour Beatty; Gord Reynolds, VP, Commercial Advisory and Strategy from Infrastructure Ontario; Mark Cichy, Principal and Director of Design Technology at HOK; and Scott Benesh, VP, Client Solutions and PMO at VEERUM. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us on this panel. And if it's okay, Dominic, I'd like to start with you to kick off the discussion today. Balfour Beatty is a company that has really been on the forefront of construction technology and is really no stranger to the digital twin conversation. What's the value to your company in having a digital twin strategy, and how are your customers responding?
It's funny, over the last 3 years, we've really started to see a push from the owners in regards to product delivery. You can put on your evangelist hat and start at the very end. What are we going towards? What do we need to do? But then you also have to put on your contractor hat and come back to the very beginning. And so we're kind of at that beginning step where we're starting to condition the models with information, starting to ask the questions earlier on. Are you guys looking for an FM solution? Are we going to transition this construction model over to your building's operations staff at the end? How can we help you achieve these goals? And then hopefully we get down the road to these kind of enhanced technology solutions to where everything really ends up looking like a Mission Impossible movie. And, guys are crawling through the ducts and they know what the CFM of the fans are, but, it's one foot in front of the other. And that's just kind of technology sometimes. And it's going to be great hearing what these guys have to say about integrating all of this together, because it sounds like Canada is really at the forefront of it.
Yeah, I appreciate that perspective, Dominic. Now for a slightly different perspective, Gord, I wanted to ask you, it seems like, and it feels like, many large owners in Canada are starting to think about digital twins in a more meaningful way than maybe we have in the past, even the last 3 or 4 years. For Infrastructure Ontario, what are the challenges and opportunities that your organization faces that you're thinking digital twins can help you address?
Well, look, as an agency of the provincial government that's responsible for modernizing and maximizing the value of public infrastructure and real estate here in Ontario, and upholding the government's commitment to renew public service in partnership with the private sector, we can't ignore the value of data and the role it plays in building and maintaining public assets. And to Dominic's point, we leap ahead and think of this sometimes as, Mission Impossible like environments. And for sure, it's a journey that begins somewhere short of that and maybe even ends somewhere short of that. But aspirationally, we recognize as an industry, that's where we need to get. And that's a challenge. That's a challenge for our partners. It's a challenge for us, but it's one that we are very keen to be working on with our private sector partners.
When you look forward at the opportunities, that resolving some of these challenges represent, the value of data of those public assets, could you speak a little bit more about, what you think the benefit to you will be in having more of that data in these public assets?
Well, let's use what's happening with utility infrastructure as just sort of a simple example, and the new ASCE 7522 standards with respect to memorializing utility infrastructure within land holdings. We We survey these buildings, with centimeter level accuracy for the Canadians on the call or the panel. And yet the critical infrastructure that we depend on to support these buildings, natural gas, telecommunications, power, many of them, if they're mapped at all, which in some cases is not the case, there's very little accuracy. And we don't have records with respect to abandoned infrastructure, and it's often difficult to tell the difference between what's old versus what's energized. And, maybe that's not a huge issue for design and planning of an office building or a condominium. But I can tell you within linear programs like highways and transit, new transmission corridors, and other endeavors that the government looks at, those are significant issues for us. And working with industry to define and adopt standards, whether they be utility infrastructure or infrastructure within a building envelope, whether it be planning and design, whether it be construction or operation, working with industry to define these standards and agree on them and adopt them will drive significant benefit. And it's going to take work. It's going to take work from us working together with academia and industry, financiers, insurers, builders, operators, to ensure we're all aligned on what that, starting with that vision of the Mission Impossible like scenario that Dominic helped paint for us.
Yeah. Look, Gord, that's great perspective, and thanks for that practical example. Mark, I wanted to move on to you. HOK is seeing growing demand in digital twins in your practice. What are your customers' use cases for the design and the data that you're producing for them?
Sorry, if I looked like I wasn't paying attention, I was just writing notes as everybody else was speaking. I want to make sure that I answer the question, but then also address the points that have been made along the way. Well, I have a lot of use cases, mostly, and obviously they differ drastically based on, like market segment and building type, who the client is, right? We just heard a little bit from Infrastructure Ontario, where, Gord just mentioned that obviously somebody who owns, occupies, or is building an asset for resale, like a condominium or mixed use building or corporate infrastructure, completely different set of use cases, looking at and evaluating different metrics, right? So it varies. Like, it's a very, very broad spectrum. And of course, we see pretty much a great deal of the cross section, whether it's aviation, right, critical infrastructure. These are all projects that we work on a daily basis across the world, not just Canada. But something I think I kind of wanted to address was the fact that I was just thinking about this as both Dominic and Gord were speaking, was the fact that in the last, I want to say 18 months, including what we've just been through around the world through COVID, I have to say that there hasn't been a single project that hasn't started that I've been a part of that step one hasn't been generating some sort of or obtaining some sort of sub-millimeter accuracy level point cloud or reality capture element to it, okay? Because most of them have either been renovations to existing buildings or additions, right? And you think of, this was just coming back to as you were speaking, Marcus, is that, a lot of the data that makes up what we call and consider and define a digital twin now exists. We're actually at a critical juncture in the industry and in construction where for the last 30 years, we've been generating a lot of the content and have the systems. We haven't really hooked them up to anything, right? So, it's almost like we have a back-end infrastructure, electrical infrastructure, but nothing's plugged into it right now. And for us, it's really, finding what is the most effective, productive, and highest return on investment for our clients, whatever industry they may be in, to be able to extract what makes the most sense for them. And a perfect example of something like that is the fact that, when you have an input and output and you have all this information and you're trying to extract for the digital twin, and the customer's you're trying to understand what the customer's use case is specifically to their market. What you find a lot of the time is none of these things actually can communicate with one another. They're all in like, vendor lock applications that have, proprietary systems. And I know we talked about this the other day, but I think part of the conversation, as much as it is understanding what you have and what is the best way to kind of use it that gives you the most critical insight into your operations or your process. But the other side of that is you need to be able to actually collate the information in an open way to be able to do that, right? Before you can analyze and you can assess, you need to be able to actually lay the things over top of one another, be able to trace what it is that you're assessing. So I think a big part of this, of course, is, generating or establishing some sort of open platform, data platform, industry-driven platform in that regard as well.
So Mark, I want to drill down on that one a little bit more with you, if that's okay. There's large technology stacks that have been building and building and building, either through acquisitions or through new means and ways of looking at gathering data or creating design. Where does that responsibility lie in what you just described in terms of getting those standards, in terms of creating this platform? Is that with the technology vendors, some of which we've talked about and some of which we've heard about earlier today? Is that with industry? Is that, with the next generation and someone else's problem down the road? What's your thought on that?
You're poking the bear. I think the other day I was actually kind of like clear. My mind has kind of shifted the more I talk about this over and over again. Initially my initial position was that it's not the vendors because we've already given them like 40 years worth of chances and they haven't done anything for us and they're still not listening. As speaking to a man who represents vendors, I understand. I think that definitely they're part of the equation because they develop the systems and the critical software that most of us use, regardless of what end of the equation we're on, whether we're an owner, an end user, or whether we're a producer of content, right? So part of it relies with the vendor. I think when it comes to developing or discussing some sort of open standard, it's everybody, right? Because it can't be onerous on anyone, right? I think part of, let's say for instance, and I'm not advocating for this, but say for instance, ISO 19650. There are some significantly onerous elements of ISO 19650 for content producers, like so much so that it's very difficult almost to be able to meet some of the bars that are set in the document. And really, one would argue that they're maybe not worth all of our time to even hit them. And in some cases, a lot of the times you don't even need that level of detail. But I think it's everybody. And I think there is a significant burden to bear on behalf of the actual, professional industry, as much as there is on the vendor side of the equation to, as I had said, contribute to a brain trust, not necessarily based on scale or driven by scale of organization, but based on skill and what you bring to the table, right? When you look at, say, I hate to use the software industry in general as kind of an example, but if you look at critical and very successful open source projects, what makes them so successful is the fact that the contributors come from a wide array of not even just like companies and scale, but also industry, right? And I think that is kind of the benefit of that's why we're having this conversation today. We've got someone that represents owners. We've got someone that represents software vendors. We've got someone who builds things, someone who designs things, right? It's not a mistake that we have a wide, diverse, representation here on this call. But I think it's short answer. Everybody has to contribute, and professionals need to, and AEC in general, including construction and architecture engineering, needs to contribute their fair share as well, I think, to advancing this, because it's no good to just whine and complain and not do anything about it.
I really wish it was as easy as like VHS versus Betamax, but it's so much more than that,
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and actually, on that perspective, in terms of someone who is trying to make attainment of digital twins more accessible to more people, Scott, I wanted to go to you. Given your company focus on digital twin solutions, are you seeing trends in what data your customers are trying to analyze or business questions they're trying to answer with your software?
Well, I would say there's probably not a big trend in the data that they're looking at. I think what the trend is how do you get the most value out of that data, right? There's no end of data being produced or collected over the last few decades. There's lots of data out there that people know that could be used for certain applications, but it's too vast, it's too large, it's too unorganized, it's too siloed for the humans that are actually out there solving the problems, doing the work, to be able to effectively use it to solve the problems or to get better at their work or to be more productive. So really what most people are looking for is, how do we take all this data that's in different formats, bring it together, be able to understand it, be able to maintain it and make it accessible to everybody in a very sort of intuitive platform that the human brain is good at, being able to understand it and analyze it. And then that's really what they're looking for, is let's make sense of this data. Let's put it in a format that our people can use to make them more productive, because this information is something they need. So as users, as owners, our job is to get that data in a format that the users can actually use and solve the problems and get better at what they do, and and really improve the way that we execute projects, democratize it. And that data is produced through the whole life cycle, from engineering to procurement to construction to operations and maintenance, from the vendors. There's so much data collected and then lost. So if we can bring it together, host it, make it, so that it doesn't get lost from one phase to another, and it's put in a format that people can use it and solve their problems.
Yeah, I think that's a great takeoff from what Mark was just describing before, in terms of just making data more accessible rather than having it locked to a file type or to a particular solution. So thank you for that. Dominic, I wanted to come back to you. From your experience, what has the commercial incentive been for owners that you've been working with to invest in digital twins? For example, will they experience a reduction in cost? Is there an increase in operational efficiency? Have you had projects where you've made this quantifiable and that they've been able to do a review?
No, not yet. I haven't been lucky enough yet. Really just trying to help set the stage. And, even when you make advances like these, I don't think you ever really see that money back. Nobody's going to go, yeah, here's $1 million in contract. I mean, I think you'll probably see it on the back end when it comes to operations management. Ideally, we're redrawing buildings less, and our buildings are getting built in the model better to be leveraged in the future. Some of the clients we're working with, the hospital owners, they're really looking at digitizing their whole portfolio and hanging on to that. So we're tackling the questions that are, we have 6 or 7 different hospital additions over the last 20 years. How do we manage all of that? So there's got to be some savings there. You get the efficiency, the knowledge, the history connected to the model. If we can figure out how to link our JMSs and our architectural management systems in there too, you got a lot of conversation bases everywhere. And the whole idea is model waiting on a building and not building waiting on a model, right? So when we start with the end in mind, and our design partners and our owners are asking us for these things, I think contractors are going to see a benefit, designers are going to see a benefit, owners are going to see a benefit, operations, all of that. It just depends on the product. We'll most likely see this coming from not heavily regulated, but government agencies really interested in creating the efficiencies in their communities. Down here in Texas, we're a little Wild West sometimes. So we like to just, design buildings, throw them out there. But I'm sure we'll catch up with you guys one of these days. And, as the owners start to come around and, they're getting the most out of their models and in the benefit of prefab, then they're realizing they have all this information siloed in there. Well, how do we leverage that? And we'll be ready to answer those questions when they happen.
One of the things that I heard you say was a reduction of redundancy, right? The rework that needs to be done.
Yeah.
From different stages, having people redo the same tasks. That probably is something that's a little bit more difficult to quantify. Time being a very important asset, the most important asset, many would argue. Sometimes easier for us to look at, a cost of material side of things as it relates to this is efficiency. But I think what you've really been talking about is time. In organizations that you've partnered with and worked with, are there some things where you've been able to say, here's a specific part of the workflow or a specific part of our process that we can absolutely say, even if we can't, even if you don't have the numbers on time, that we've absolutely reduced redundancy?
Yeah, I mean, just from the standpoint of, we're going to help you stand up this process. It might not be a ISO 19650 or something super in depth, but we're going to help you get the most out of your model on the level that you will need the information in the future. So no, we haven't measured anything, and that's our fault. We should definitely be putting some KPIs in place. But yes, we've stood up processes with, 2 to 3 of our owners now to where, we'll give them the 20 things they need in the model. And while I know that's not, the RPM on a fan and a VAV box, we're on our way to that information, or at least getting the cards out of the manufacturers to dump into some digital dashboard for them, right?
Absolutely. Well, look, I apologize for putting you on the spot, but that's kind of the consultant in me coming out on.
Yeah.
So
what are your KPIs, man?
There you go. Hey, Mark, I wanted to come back to you. Do you see HOK's business model changing, with this introduction of digital twins and the potential to impact, what we've been talking about in terms of that life cycle management with the design and data your team's creating for your clients?
In short, our business model doesn't change. It's the services we're capable of providing that would change. I mean, we're still driven, to build and design comprehensively amazing architecture, right? I mean, that's kind of like why we go to work every day, what we're educated in. But certainly things like what we're discussing today help facilitate and create kind of a feedback loop between the end and the beginning, I would argue. Whereas I would say that, once you've actually connected and measured something, you have a very high degree in understanding of how well something works, right? And so silly things like we've seen with like some clients where just circulation and occupancy tracing, right? Something super silly. You always have an intention when you design something, in your mind, you work with experience, right? Your prior experience, what works best generally, right? So, when you design something like, say, workplace for a client, there are certain configurations that, based on experience are optimal, but also driven by client need, right? Like, do they have a higher degree need for flexible space? Do they need closed offices? Do they need a higher ratio of conference rooms to, say, personal space, right? And what kind of personal space? But what we found certainly within the last couple of years, as things have people have started to reoccupy buildings, and we've been obtaining information, tracing occupancy, and these sort. Like I'm speaking about a specific market right now, is that some of those assumptions we made were wrong, right? Everyone has said like business not as usual. Well, yeah, we have the data and the diagrams to show that people are no way interested in going back to something that the client specifically requested because they thought that would be, something that would be crucial to the business, but realize that it isn't as you measure it, right? So that's a silly example. One thing I wanted to say is that, because this it addresses part of the question you say, does the business model change? I would say in a very specific instance on a very special and certain project, contractually, I had a conversation with the client to amend the wording in the contract to address a larger goal that I knew would eventually occur as it came to incorporating content and planning for long-term on a campus driven project, multiple buildings, the capability of measuring hardware, IoT, connecting to the model via building a digital twin of an entire campus of buildings. And, this comes back to the point, and I was writing my notes here, it was just what you guys were talking about, or you were talking about with Dominic about reducing redundancy, right? Man hours, that's where your energy is, right? So, typically on the back end for most projects, we never get engaged in things like as-built drawings or anything like that, right? That's normally falls into the contractor's court, and we do that purely out of fear of liability. But contractually on this specific project, we are actually obliged to provide said service to produce as-built drawings, right? Which generally are just like incorporating red lines from the GC into the contract docs to amend things and indicate that if a column or a duct or something moved, here's where it moved to, right? So the CA team usually just marks up a PDF. I thought, I'm just going to say we thought that it would be a shame that if the end goal was to, connect to a digital twin, that one would probably want to know in three-dimensional space where that thing is and not have a model that has a note in it that says, oh yeah, this isn't located here, it's actually over there, right? So we know as part of the contract that we are going to be scanning by layer, right, infrastructural layer, the entire building as we proceed through construction. Why not use that data, right? Well, we can't, and it's not accepted because the contract stipulates that it needs to actually be a model. Well, let's define what a model is. What constitutes a model? Many things constitute a model. So you have to have an amendment added that says these forms are all acceptable. Once you have that, you no longer have to draw anything because you have reality to sub-millimeter accuracy in a digital twin, which actually captures every layer. So if a guy needs to service a conduit that's behind a duct, he knows where those layers are because he can turn off or on. And furthermore, anybody that services or is part of the maintenance or operations team can go through that process, right? So I just gave you two examples where, they're just two practical examples. One, obviously, from the workplace side of things, and the other one is institutional. But that has a severe impact, but it also means that we have to think about this before we build it. And we have to know and put those, guardrails in place, those hurdles in place so that when we come to them, we either jump them or we dodge them, right? And the client needs to be on board with that also.
Yeah. And so I'm going to follow up on that just for a second. Do you think that just becomes an additional expectation from your customers in terms of what you're providing? Or do you think that this is something that can be a new revenue stream for you where you're providing something that maybe others aren't?
Certainly right now. So here's the thing, right? As things become ubiquitous, they become expected. When you come to the client with something and you say, here are some, well, actually, I'll back up a bit. Let's say you're going to an interview for a project, right? Before you even got the job. And you're showing examples in the interview of stuff that you've done and can do given the circumstance and what you perceive the challenge is, right? Before, as you discuss with the client. Then you're bringing that to the table. I've been in some interviews in some cases where the client has brought it to the table and expected the service as part of the service that you provide, that you do that, right? But you have to set expectations and say, this is a significant investment. Like, you don't just step into this. We can't assume the cost of like man hours of scanning, as they probably know and are adept to that. But there's also that whole facet of making the connection, the data connection, that everything flows, and assessing the conditions that are in front of you because it's different every single time. For now, if we had standards, we could go with a certain level of we'd walk in with a level of certainty that we know that essentially what you're going to get, which is generally how construction, yes, there are exceptions, right? Because you have, let's just look at this from both my side as well as the GC side of the equation. You design some crazy cantilever that no one's ever done before, and it's like 100 meters long, right? 300 feet for Dominic, by the way. And it's just crazy. No one's done that, right? So yeah, there's an expectation there that it's unique. It's a one-off, and so that's going to cost some coin. Right now, we're still in that place where it's unique enough and disconnected enough, and not, set up in a way that its initial success, you just need to snap your fingers, that the expectation is that it's an ad service. But I can see a time where if everything goes well, and then it becomes expected, it means that everyone here has done their job. and truthfully, it just becomes something that gets done, right? But that starts at so many levels, contractually, even like if we're talking about Gord, like it could be even part of policy, right? There's a policy component. It could be crazy. So yeah.
Yeah. And I know Gord is chomping at the bit, and Gord, I'm going to get to you in a second, but I wanted to go to Scott. Scott, how are your customers differentiating between, a digital twin from the VDC and collaborating technology that may have been used for many years? Is this a rebranding, or do you really see clients realizing a unique ROI from the value of digital twins?
So I find it interesting that at each of these events, and this one even, people usually start their talk with what is a digital twin. And then you see in the chat, people are, debating what is a digital twin. I believe a digital twin is all of the above, including the VDC, including CAD models, including everything. The digital twin is something that brings that all together, like I said before, so that it can be used. So, these other tools can be siloed. They can need special SMEs to operate them. And the digital twin brings it together in that common viewing environment so that people can understand it and use it to solve the problems that they have. So if we can take these other systems and turn them into a common viewing environment, see them all together so that, you can start to get some ROI out of it, then first of all, it helps people believe what they're looking at. Is the data true? Is it right? Because as whenever we are trying to understand and believe some data, what we do is we go to multiple sources and verify that they're all the same in all those different sources, kind of like blockchain, right? So people run around. I know I used to go from a drawing, run out to the field, and then look on the CAD model and then try and decide what's true. Imagine if that's all those things are in one viewing environment where you can see what the engineers did, you can see what's actually in the field with a laser scan, you can click on it and you can see the operating temperature, the operating pressure, all in one place. Now I believe it. So instead of taking a day to know that my information is correct and I can act on it, it's a matter of seconds or minutes. So really, that's really the difference that you get from that. So it's really bringing that information together so that I can solve those problems. And now with all that data correlated together, and I make a decision, or I can understand what my progress is or my quality is, and then I make an action on that, I can make sure I'm doing the right decision and I'm more productive. Now, with all that information in one data, one system, and we're making decisions and actions based on that. Now we can start to train AI and ML engines to watch us and see what's happening, and then start to train that to help us make decisions better going forward. Was that the right decision? Yes or no? So you've made a decision based on these parameters or these data sets. If it's the right decision, that AI ML engine that we're building can now help and make sure I make the right decision going forward, or at least advise me on the risks that can be had from that. So, in short, it's really making that data agnostic so that all the different data sets, like there's really good tools out there that we don't want to throw away just because they may be in an old system. We want to be able to bring them in and still use them. There's a lot of good stuff, different tools out there that we want to be able to bring together. So it's really bringing it all together and not losing what we already have, and then being able to learn from that to be able to, do things better going forward, both in engineering, construction, doing progress, quality and analysis, and then in operations and maintenance, having all that information at your fingertips so that you can either make better decisions, work remotely, do it safer, etc. So.
Yeah, so Scott, it's interesting. I hear you saying very much what Dominic and what Mark were talking about earlier about the reduction in redundancy of tasks. But the other thing that I think that you were just touching on was this ability to make better decisions. And I wonder if, rather than necessarily just making better decisions, what I hear you saying is that there's potential for making improving decision velocity, right? How do we actually make the same decision that we might have made without having to check on site, without having to check the drawing, without having to check with engineering? Can you talk to me a little bit about that? Are you seeing customers realize some of the benefits around decision velocity?
Yeah, well, you can ask anybody in the field whenever they have a problem to solve or they have a task to do. I know you can spend up to 80% of your time, first of all, seeking out the truth, seeking out what's actually going on, right? That's 80% of your time. And then the decision becomes easy. Sometimes it's just a very quick decision once you know everything that's true. So, that's really the guts of making people faster at making decisions. When you can make decisions faster, you're going to find out you have less problems going down the road. Right? You may have a construction issue. If it takes you 3 days to resolve a construction issue, and then there's a work crew, a work face that can't progress because of that, if you can reduce that to seconds or minutes or even hours, that really makes a difference in the cost and schedule of a project or a task in an operating plant.
That's great. Really appreciate that perspective. I think that was one key takeaway that I took from that. Gord, I want to follow up with you now. I know that you've been kind of biting your tongue as some of these other conversations have been going on that I've been asking the other panelists, and I might be putting you on the spot to ask you this question. If I am, I apologize in advance, but I think the audience would be interested in your perspective on the value of digital twins that you see, right? Given that government in this country is a huge owner for the projects that create the communities we live in, is there perhaps a different set of business objectives than perhaps a private owner would have? And can you comment on this and the impact to the societal value, right? And the societal obligation, right? That you think digital twins, could bring?
Absolutely. Now, let me use a couple of outside the building envelope examples, because this is where we've started really driving meaningful change. If I use our transit portfolio, for example, 5 very ambitious transit programs to address the reality that we are expecting an almost 50% growth by about 2051 in the Greater Toronto Hamilton area. We need to build 1.5 million homes in the next 10 years. And to do that, we just candidly need to build transit faster. And so we passed legislation that compelled industry to work with us differently to just that end, to build transit faster. And I think you used the term the velocity of decision making, which is really appropriate in this case. And I love Scott's example of about 80% of the effort is just getting to the truth. And many of our delays around these large linear builds, that is one of our major constraints. And so you'll notice that one of the key tenets of the Building Transit Faster Act is just that, the ability for us to get better information sooner, retain that information, and share it amongst parties. For example, changes to the Ontario One Call Act that extend the validity period of locates, that allow the ability for contractors to share locates as opposed to rework over and over again. We're now getting the industry to work together more collaboratively. If we look at broadband, something that we've all probably either personally experienced or know somebody that's experienced over the last couple of years, right? Being connected is critically important as we've had to work, learn, get care from home, stay connected from home. If you didn't have a good connection, you really struggled and you may have been left behind the last couple of years. Government's committed to solving that problem. Here in Ontario, we have almost 770,000 Ontarians who didn't have the minimum level of internet connection to qualify for what we would call high-speed internet. So we have, again, passed legislation, Building Broadband Faster Act, Getting Ontario Connected Act, two very ambitious pieces of legislation that allow us to improve the ability to make decisions quickly and get broadband built more quickly, with a commitment to doing that by 2025. You can't do that without sharing information. To do that, we have started the journey of digital twins by creating what we call Broadband One Window, which is creating that single version of truth that allows all infrastructure owners to be able to rely on critical infrastructure data that they need to plan, design, build, and operate all of these projects. Now, I get we're outside the building envelope here. This really is low-hanging fruit to us. Building highways faster, building transit faster, building broadband faster. You know, that's where we're starting. So we think about the digital twin journey, right? It's we're really picking off the areas where government can have a huge impact, can compel industry. And there are a lot of industry players that recognize the benefits and stepped up voluntarily. We don't have to compel everybody, but there are some who need to be brought to the table with very clear riverbanks for what is expected, so that all our partners can be performant and can drive better outcomes, reduce costs to Ontarians. And so we're starting here. And as we move forward and look at other large capital programs that the government is responsible for executing on or funding, we're starting to work with industry to understand how do we bring that inside the building envelope. And we've talked about, and I think we all acknowledge that this data is not data that we've just started creating, right? I mean, whether it's 20 or 30 years that we've been producing a lot of this information, whether it be design, 2D, 3D, sensor-led data, that data has existed. It's just been vendor locked in these proprietary platforms. How do we unlock that? This is what we're working on now and have successfully done with transit and broadband, and we're looking to expand that. And we're working with academia to really understand the benefits of that, and they're significant.
Yeah. Gord, that's incredibly aspirational. I want to thank you for sharing that perspective. Ton of notes that I made there about 1.5 million homes in the next 10 years, the number of people that didn't have broadband or high-speed access, and your organization working to change that and standardize that. I want to actually go to the chat for a follow-up question, Gord. Farzad was asking a question about what's the role that government has in the standardization and the data exchange process. Kind of something that I was poking Mark about earlier, but I was wondering, taking that theme, if there is something that you might have in the way of a comment about how government has a role to play in this.
Well, if we look at what other geographies have done, whether it be a state level model in Australia, whether it be a nationalized model in the UK, I don't see a dissimilar model here in Ontario, where we're a catalyst to this industry adoption. And I mentioned earlier the utility infrastructure data, right, is something I think we all acknowledge ought and needs to be improved. And we view that our role is to help create that shared platform where there is a high degree of trust in that information. So as we're designing and planning and constructing projects, we're doing it with confidence. Same can be true on other capital projects as well. We don't view our role, I don't think, as being one where we own this data or even the orchestrator of this exchange of data, but rather, and I like the model that I think that Mark mentioned that once it's, ubiquitous, it becomes expected, right? I mean, we want to create that expectation so that it becomes ubiquitous, right? And whether we had to create it on some of our programs through legislative compulsions or it's just being industry led, I'm not sure that we're prejudiced to one or the other, but we want it to become a level of expectation. The saying that tide, will rise all boats, and we want to see that happen. We're going to start with low-hanging fruit and compulsions. We have started there, and we're going to be working with industry to find, whether it's inspiration or desperation, gets us to a place where we're improving outcomes together.
I just want to piggyback on that, actually, because Gord, I think one of the things, and I was sitting here at probably a duck on water situation, by the way, feet were going crazy under the water, but I think, and I'm about to actually advocate for more work on the behalf of the consultant, which some of my partners would probably hit me on the head with a bat. But I really think that part of, even if it's like legislatively required to do business in Ontario or wherever in the world, the quickest way to actually get the content that gives everyone, let's call it open data, right, access and on equal footing would be to require service providers to give you the information in an open format that others could use. And I'm going to use your example, actually, because you had a really good one, because you're right. We have actually been talking, and I'm guilty of it, mostly been talking about inside the envelope. But actually, as you were speaking, Gord, I was thinking about everything outside of that. So anything critical infrastructure, large infrastructure, underground rail, above ground rail, sewage services, like all building services infrastructure that even is everything in between, right? Public space, even parks. If the people who do the work for this are required to maintain a certain minimum level of standard of the information that they provide, not just the geometry, we're talking like the 3D geometry, but also the data associated with that. And that becomes part of like some form of open legislated standard. It means that we all of a sudden have an open digital equivalent, even if it's dead and not connected, it's not live, because I would argue that the twin aspect of things is when it becomes live, and everything before that is BIM. But that data actually gets passed on in a form that is open and unilaterally accessible. That actually then could be used. And if you think about this, half the time I spend looking for information or asking the previous consultant or somebody else connected to the neighboring building that I might know through industry, do you guys have a model you can share? Which 90% of the time the answer is no, because they consider it proprietary. But if we force people to make it open, right, because of open standards, you're not giving them the energy and the IP involved in making that thing. You're giving them the thing, right? The end result, which then makes it easier for everybody else to do their work, but also would contribute to just like better design, because that's the 80% gone, right? Like or maybe not 80%, but maybe it's 30 or 40. And so you're starting already that far ahead of the game. So I think that's an excellent point you made. I wanted to add another layer of complexity and make more work for myself.
Look, Mark, I think that's a great point. And I think one of the things that we're hearing here is that there's tremendous benefits down the road. Maybe not up front, because it requires a lot more coordination, a lot more work, and frankly, a lot more investment by all of us, right? Not just this panel, but certainly everyone listening in across the industry, across vendors, government, all of us, even as a collection of individuals. And I think that is a great message. And I hope that there's an opportunity that this panel can come together again in the future, so that there's more time for questions from the group. But I do want to hand things back to close out this digital twin session. The MC can begin to close out and share their final remarks. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you to all of you who tuned in. And I look forward to another opportunity in the future to have this group come together and more questions asked of this group. Thanks, everyone.